Nonetheless, Goethe dedicated Schröter a statue of a statue.
Goethe's Italian journey. Imitation, initiation, and discovery of the secret sacred self.
Guten Tag. My name is Charlie Brown from Charlie's Little Corner, and I'll be your tour guide to Goethe's Italian journey for the next few hours. We will visit his birthplace Frankfurt and travel to Leipzig and Strasbourg, where he studies law. Since Goethe had so many relationships to women, this will be a short detour we'll make. And finally, today we will discuss his views on life and death in general. This will be the first of a few episodes that will sketch the background to the actual Italian journey of Goethe that took place between September 1786 and May 1788. In later episodes, we will not only take a closer look at his early works, Götz von Berlichingen and his Sorrows of Young Werther, but we will have the opportunity to review the dramas Iphigenia on Tauris and Egmont and Toccato Tasso, which he all finalized and published as an upshot of the journey. Since this is the first episode, I'll briefly review the literature that I have read and used to create this podcast. Now, up front, I have to apologize if this doesn't always look like it's in an orderly fashion, because at many points of writing and working on this podcast series, I was mesmerized, excited, overwhelmed by all the rabbit holes that you could fall into when you try to research Goethe. And as such, you will very often find minor or major distractions, detours, and additional commentaries, side notes that I felt were just too interesting to drop them from this podcast series. So, even though this is not an academic work, it took a lot of research into academic literature about Goethe, his life, his thoughts, and his works, and the age that he was living in. And if you're wondering why I might sound so nasal, that's because, for one thing, I promised to drop the first episode of this podcast series before Christmas to some of my friends on the German language channel of the Bridges of Meaning Estuary Hub. And for another thing, I'm still recovering from a recent COVID episode that I had, so maybe that explains why I sound the way I do. In future episodes, I hope that will not be an issue any longer. Today we will look at Goethe's earlier years and upbringing, his education and studies of law in Leipzig and Strasbourg. We will look at his relationship to women, where he drew a lot of inspiration for his work and life, and we will make a detour to see how Goethe deals with the issue of death. This and more in the next 45 minutes. Goethe was born and raised in the free city of Frankfurt, a Protestant town in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire and coronation site for the emperors. His father, a lawyer by profession, was of such wealth he did not have to work at all. Goethe's mother, Katharina Elisabeth, was married to Johann Caspar Goethe at the age of 18. Goethe's father was 39 at the time of marriage, very old by the day's standards. Already as a child, Katharina was known to rather read novels instead of doing housework. Young Johann Wolfgang would be fixated on his mother, who told fairy tales and would make up stories. If Johann was unsatisfied with the course of the story, he would lament to his grandmother, and his grandmother would whisper to his mother. His mother then would make sure that the story would develop in a way that Johann would be fond of, and in doing so, she would inspire Goethe to have a poetic perspective on reality. From his birth, Johann Wolfgang struggled with life. The umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck, almost choking him to death. He got measles, chickenpox, and even smallpox. How he survived the terrible disease is miraculous itself. 1 in 3 children died of this disease. Now, mind you, smallpox vaccine was developed as early as 1721 in Great Britain, but a safer vaccine would be developed in 1796 by using bovine pox lymph. Protestant clergy in Scandinavia would herald voluntary vaccination, whereas the Catholic Kingdom of Bavaria would be the first state worldwide to introduce a mandatory vaccination by law in 1807. Prussia would follow in 1815, the German Empire by 1874. Mandatory vaccinations are by no means a phenomenon of recent times. Goethe's grandfather had been a tailor. He clothed the high society of Frankfurt and later would marry a wealthy widow of an innkeeper. At his death, the grandfather left 2 houses, several plots of land, and cash assets of 100,000 thaler. By today's standards, his family were millionaires. In all his lifetime, Goethe would not once have to think about working to earn money. During his studies at the University of Leipzig, his father sent him a monthly payment that would have been a year's wage for an artisan. Once he moved to the court of Weimar, Duke Karl August would become his lifetime sponsor. This did actually enable Goethe to become well known for his generosity and hospitality. But Goethe, as with most issues in his own life, wasn't attracted by wealth as an end in itself. This is where Sartre probably did some heavy lifting from Goethe, did not believe man or woman have an essence. Rather, you are the sum of your actions. What you do is what you are. Goethe had a heartwarming generosity because that is who he wanted to be. Among many other things, it was his conviction that you should do everything you can in the spheres of your restricted influence to make the world a better place. If that meant to be poetic, he would be. If it meant to be generous, so be it. If it meant being harsh and judgmental, of course. In the words of Cecil, the doing is what you are. In his time, you were born with an essence, either aristocratic or peasant, but Goethe redefined it. It's not what you are by birth that defines you, but what you make of what you have. Goethe challenges where we come from and where we go to. And early on already, we can see that Goethe implies a certain mode of development, of change, of flux that will be present throughout his own life, but also throughout his work and his scientific research. Since Goethe's father had time to spare, he took it up as a task to give his son Johann Wolfgang the best education available. Goethe was taught by his father and several private teachers. He attended public school for just a year before his father would step in. Goethe wrote and spoke and read many languages: French, German, English, Italian, Latin, Greek, even Hebrew was on his schedule. And so he would eventually read the Old Testament texts in their original language. Due to his excellent education, he was literate in all of Greek and Roman mythology and philosophy. Goethe's father was a respectable authority that took it to his task to imbue his son with all the education possible. He was not one Goethe needed to rebel against. In his memoirs, Goethe spoke highly in favor of his father's pedantic diligence and persistence. Goethe will later state in his literary work,
I got my stature from my father, the serious leading of life, from my mother, the cheerful nature and the desire to fable.
He continues with his ancestors and closes that if the elements cannot be separated from the complex, then what in this whole wretch, by which he refers to himself, is to be called original? The cheerful nature of his mother is easy to explain because in age, Katharina was closer to her children than to her own husband. Goethe's father had studied in Leipzig and Gießen and earned a doctoral degree in law in Wetzlar. But instead of pursuing a career as a lawyer, he'd first embark on a grand tour to Italy and return via Paris and Amsterdam. The following decade, he spent his time with writing a memoir about his stays in Venice, Milano, and Rome. Although Goethe's grandfather had urged Johann Caspar to take up a job, Johann Caspar instead bought himself a noble title. Published in a huge quarto, The travel memoirs strangely anticipate all the inclinations of the son Johann Wolfgang. The interest in sciences, minerals, observations of natural phenomena from a grain of dust to the development of all natural phenomena in general, and even a love story with an Italian woman in Milano. At the tender age of 16, Goethe moved to Leipzig to follow his father's footsteps to become a lawyer. It is the first time he is outside the controlling sphere of his despotic father in Frankfurt. Instead of studying law, he visits the theatre to watch Molière's Tartuffe or Lessing's Minna von Barnhelm. He soon also attended literary lectures. The young Goethe was particularly taken with the seminars of Johann Christoph Gottsched and Christian Fürchtegott Gellert. These two professors were open-minded and modern-thinking teachers. Gellert is also regarded as a pioneer of the Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, style in literary history which focused on emotion and imagination. Influenced by this new spirit, Goethe also began to write his first poems, which were strongly influenced by emotion and passion. As Nicholas Boyle remarks in his grand Goethe biography, Goethe, the Poet and the Age,
for the first time we meet in this period a peculiar duality characteristic of Goethe's whole life, and indeed of his posthumous reputation. Those who are distant from him, or who know him only slightly, are repelled by what seems like his unfeeling arrogance. Those who are close to him are irresistibly attracted by the warmth and energy of an independent and unspoiled personality. To some extent, Goethe made himself prominent among his 600 contemporaries in the usual undergraduate ways. He dressed extravagantly, conversed annihilatingly, took a leading part in the traditional uproar before lectures, frequented dubious taverns, and paid court to an unidentified society woman of easy virtue. Yet, added to this public persona a peculiar cutting edge, a courtier's contempt for the public before which he performed. In one respect, of course, the freshman Goethe could hardly avoid drawing attention to himself. With a monthly allowance of 100 guilders, he was at least twice as well off as any student needed to be, even at the most expensive universities.
Party hard and fast. His dad paid for it after all. He basically manifested Dionysos, the god of wine, joy, and ecstasy. He remains rather shy and uptight opposite women, but then again he's just 16 years of age. Nonetheless, in his letter to his sister, he will boast about his success with Saxony women. It's all about sex. There are historical depictions of student books of that time. I seek it in fire, I seek it in air, I seek it in earth. And it continues with a naked woman pointing to her lap. What you seek, I have it here. Goethe, just the male teenager, but already poetically writes about it. Although there is an antecedent to it, even earlier than his studying years in Leipzig. Frankfurt am Main, the traditional location of the coronations of the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, was the scene of a half-majestic, half-ghostly world theatre in 1764, as the eyewitness Johann Wolfgang von Goethe put it. The ritual that unfolded around the election of the Habsburg Crown Prince Joseph was a magnificent spectacle of a world in decline. Goethe portrays this coronation in his autobiography Poetry and Truth, Dichtung und Wahrheit, in an arabesque narrative of two threads, the one dealing with the coronation, the other with Goethe and a girl named Gretchen. Goethe, 15 years of age, has an infatuation with an older teenage girl, probably a waitress in one of the many inns in Frankfurt. Hand in hand, they observe the coronation. According to biographer Rüdiger Safranski, Gretchen has to leave Frankfurt because of this inappropriate scene. She is quoted with the words,
I can't deny that I saw him often and liked him, but I always thought of him as a child, and my affection for him was truly sisterly.
Johann Wolfgang was so offended by this that he got sick and rages.
That I had sacrificed sleep and rest and health for the sake of a girl who was pleased to regard me as an infant and to think herself most amicably wise towards me.
If you're searching for a namesake of the famous Faust Gretchen, there it is. And there's more to Faust than Frankfurt, but we'll get there. His first big passion in Leipzig, Anna Katharina Schönkopf, is the daughter of a restaurant owner. He calls her Kätchen. Beautiful as she is, she's 3 years older than him. He thinks her experience with men indicates she loves him. He raves for her in utter misapprehension. She never even kisses him. He reinterprets this failure in a letter to Frankfurt. A girl is such a wonderful creature that I could not stand them being spoiled. It is in Leipzig that he will begin his lifelong project, the refinement or ennobling of women. As a side note, Dionysos has often been described in literature and poetry as Anthroporheistes, man-crusher. And in Leipzig, Goethe's health would eventually be crushed so dreadfully that he wrote a letter to one of his infatuations saying he did not know if he would survive much longer. In 1768, at the end of his studies in Leipzig, he has a massive hemorrhage. A doctor rushes by and diagnoses a life-threatening lung sickness, probably tuberculosis. He develops an ulcer on his left side neck. At the age of 19, he is close to death. He has to return to Frankfurt, where he will be taken care of by his mother and sister and by Ernst Theodor Langer, a kind and caring mystic and alchemist who sympathized with the Moravian brethren. After a time of convalescence, Goethe's father urges him to finish his legal studies, and Goethe will, this time in Strasbourg, where Goethe will not only finish his legal studies but also earn a doctoral degree. As in Leipzig, where Goethe used his part-time study of law to dive into art, literature and poetry, so he will use the time in Strasbourg to also attend scientific lectures and seminars in chemistry. From his early academic years, Goethe had a pronounced desire to know what keeps the world together. Strasbourg is an important episode in Goethe's life. Here, he not only lays the groundwork for his professional career as a lawyer, he also meets 5-year-older Johann Gottfried Herder, whom he will cherish as an older brother. Herder was a theologian, philosopher, and literary theorist. Herder will make Goethe acquainted with the works of Ovid and Ossian, Shakespeare and the Earl of Shaftesbury, Voltaire and Rousseau. Herder also introduces Goethe to folklore songs and poetry, which will have an immediate impact on Goethe, as we will soon see. The creative spirit of Goethe will take all of this in, transform and reconstruct it to create a whole new universe of drama and poetry. Much like the Big Bang, Goethe will comment on this episode in his life in his autobiography Poetry and Truth with the words, "The most significant event which should have the most important consequences for me." At the mediation of Goethe, in 1776, Duke Karl August of Weimar-Saxony will appoint Herder as the superintendent of his duchy. And here's a spicy anecdote. Both Goethe and Herder will be initiated into the Bavarian Illuminati order. Herder had already been a Freemason since his time in Riga. Goethe too was a Freemason, of which he became a member in 1780. Goethe, the free spirit, studies the order and writes with the participant observation and will become an ardent critic, as can be glimpsed from a letter of 1789 that he wrote to the Duke Karl August.
Jena was, as you know, threatened with a lodge. I have also made a suggestion to the directors of the Lit, Zeitung, which they have accepted, which will give all secret societies a severe blow. They will soon read it in print. And so it is good to put public enmity between oneself and the fools and rogues. The legal people all gain by publicity.
Anyways, back to Goethe in Strasbourg. It is there that he meets his first great love, the pastor's daughter, Friederike Birion. It is from this time that Goethe will develop his poems that would become part of a cycle called the Sesenheimer Lieder, not in the style classical poetry, but free-flowing organic lyricism in the style of folk songs. Goethe creates Willkommen und Abschied, Mailied, and Heidenröslein. And if you know any of those poems, you can be sure that the first great love didn't go well. Willkommen und Abschied is one of my favorites of Goethe's poems because it's beautiful in its tempo, tone, and imagery, deeply melancholic. Here's a quote.
But alas, already with the morning sun, the parting constricts my heart. What bliss in your kisses, in your eye, what pain. I went, you stood and looked down to earth, and looked after me with watery eyes. And yet, what bliss to be loved, and to love gods, what bliss!
In an act of confrontational therapy, Goethe, suffering from severe vertigo, climbs the 330 steps of the cathedral tower over and over again until he becomes indifferent to heights. Although Immanuel Kant had exclaimed that in the face of the magnificent man becomes aware of his smallness and learns humility, Goethe and his time saw that human creativity can create splendor. Creative energy, therefore, is responsible for human greatness. And this greatness is found in the figure of the genius. Writing about the cathedral in Strasbourg, Goethe says,
Few have been given the capacity to beget a Babel thought in the soul.
Goethe aspired to building such a tower by doing everything to become such a genius. However, the love affair did not last long. In the early summer of 1771, Goethe, who compared his restless soul to the weathercock over there on the church tower, was already thinking of ending the relationship. In August of 1771, he saw Friederike for the last time before returning home to Frankfurt, and as he writes, "As I reached out my hand to her from the horse, tears welled up in her eyes and I felt very sick." He left glorious Alsace just 1 week later. It was not until he wrote Friederike a letter from Frankfurt that the relationship was finally broken off. Friederike's reply
tore my heart apart. I always felt that I missed her, and worst of all, I could not forgive myself for my own unhappiness. Here I was guilty for the first time, but the parting was final.
Until the end of her life, Friederike would remain unmarried. Goethe, women, Eros. Please bear with me, but this warrants a detour at this point. As it always does with Goethe, because basically everything you can read of him or about him is absorbing. Goethe, women, stacks of books have been written about it, both fictional and non-fictional. While I don't have enough time and space to properly lay out all the intricacies of this recurrent theme in Goethe's life, it should become pretty obvious that Goethe took a lot of his inspiration from women and the differing kinds and qualities of relationships he had or didn't have with them throughout his lifetime, and through the act of sublimation turns overwhelming experience into poetry. Goethe loves his mother and sister dearly. So much that it edges on the incestuous. In 1963, Kurt Eisler, renowned psychoanalyst, Goethe lover and director of the Sigmund Freud archives in New York, published Goethe, a psychoanalytic study. In it he deals with the frequent death wishes Goethe had, the incest motifs in his life, even proposed homosexual tendencies. Which is difficult enough for an author that said of himself,
"The world may know what I have become and what I have achieved, but how I went about it in detail remains my own secret."
Thomas Ans, another German literature scholar, gives Eisler's analysis a thorough reading and writes,
Eisler makes this intimate sibling love, which was burdened by the ban on incest, jealous possessiveness, and feelings of guilt, the key to Goethe's love life and literary fantasy. It was no coincidence that he so often fell in love with sexually taboo women who were impossible to marry. Here he repeated the conflicts in his relationship with Cornelia.
Rüdiger Safransky reconstructs an event in the childhood of Goethe. One day, the parents are away from home, and Johann Wolfgang begins throwing tableware out of the kitchen window, enjoying the noise of the cracking crockery. The parents were not amused. Neither was Sigmund Freud, who would analyze this episode and find that Goethe portrayed subliminal aggression of a child that did not want to share the attention of the mother with anyone else. After all, as Eisler sees it, it was thanks to Cornelia that he was saved from psychosis when he returned ill from Leipzig to Frankfurt. During the crisis of his youth, she was the emotional support he needed to survive as much as his literary productivity. But he will also betray his beloved Cornelia, talented and intelligent as she was. As a teenager, he will show her his male superiority. The more she is equal to him, the more he condescends. He forces her into an unloved marriage. But it was also she who, through her marriage, caused his brother the severe trauma of loss from which he struggled to free himself. At the age of 26, she dies while in labor. Later in his life, one of Goethe's romantic relationships was Corona Schröter, who for some time was the leading actress at the Courts Theatre in Weimar, of which Goethe was the director. Such was their relationship that Corona Schröter handed Goethe her only copy of her autobiography. But of all the letters written between them, Goethe destroyed all of them except for one at the end of their relationship. He basically writes to her, "Well, things went bad, but let's stay friends and forget the past." One can imagine what the content of their epistles must have looked like. Nonetheless, Goethe dedicated Schröter a statue of armor feeding the nightingale, which tells us a lot about how Goethe saw himself. Goethe wrote a short poem about it.
Cupid has surely, O singer, nurtured thee. Childishly the god handed you food with his arrow slurping. You sucked poison into the innocent throat, and with love's violence Philomene's heart is struck.
Just like with Friederike Briand, Corona Schröter would remain unmarried for the rest of her life. That's a weird and uncomfortable observation here. The women that Goethe had relationships with either were unhappily married, not married at all, or died an early death. Goethe and women, so much for another Dionysian parallel. According to one interpretation, Dionysus was son, companion, lover, hero, or demon of the earth, with many relationships to many goddesses. In a sense, he became a god of goddesses. According to several myths, the Greek goddess Hera, who loathed Dionysus, struck the latter with madness, after which he traveled to the south, through Syria and Egypt. And out of the blue, without informing a soul at the court of Weimar, Goethe will embark on a journey to his own mythical south, Italy. A journey that will change him and his work, not just poetically. The South seems to have a mysterious quality to it, sensual forces attracting men and women in need of change in their lives. From a geographical and meteorological standpoint, living in Weimar, this could hardly come as a surprise. In Italy, he experiences nature in such an intense way that it will propel him to write scientifically about plants and their development and about colors. His phenomenological approach to science and his research in diverse fields as geology, botany, physics, and even anatomy would be worth a whole series on its own. Goethe and aging, Goethe and death. Let's say Johann Wolfgang is quite peculiar when it comes to these issues. And then again utterly modern. He simply defies aging and death, even to the point of ridiculing himself as an old man because he wants to marry a 17-year-old girl, Ulrike von Levetzow, whose mother obviously declines the proposal. With Ulrike von Levetzow, he found his prominence to be of little use. His age was being accounted for, something he had despised all his life. Let us not speak of age, but only about love. Goethe survived everyone. his fellow literates, his wife, his children, his intimate relationships. He was old, very old by the standards of his day. He foresaw his own development in a poem called Tombstone Inscription.
Closed and defiant as a boy, as a youth arrogant and stubborn, as a man ready for action, as an old man reckless and grim, they will read on your gravestone, that was truly a man.
In that regard, his behavior towards Ulrike von Levetzow is exactly that, reckless and grim. He had the audacity to ask his friend Karl August to propose on his part to the mother of Ulrike. Remind you, Ulrike was 17 then, and Goethe was infatuated like a teenager. He traveled to Marienbad to stay in the same hotel as the family Levetzow. A German TV documentary of Goethe's final years depicts him as an old man vigorously trying to look younger by putting on makeup. And it is this scene that reminded me of another one of the greatest German authors, Thomas Mann, and his late work, Death in Venice. Few works have had such a lasting impact on me as this little novella. I read it first in high school, and I have not been able to forget it to this day. The short novel is about an old writer yearning to travel to the south. Gustav von Aschenbach, the main character, was widowed at a young age. He was so successful a writer that he was ennobled. It is full of symbolic referrals to death. The description of colors, for example, foreshadow the end of Aschenbach already at the beginning of his journey. He meets pale, red-headed men with yellow teeth. One of them will say to him, "I can row you well." While that is actually true in Venice, it also refers to Charon, the ferryman of Hades in Greek mythology that takes the deceased across the river Styx to the land of the dead. By the way, this is also essentially what Christa Berg's Don't Pay the Ferryman is about. In Venice, Aschenbach is uplifted but also consequently obsessed by the sight of a stunningly beautiful young man named Tacho. He secretly follows and watches Tacho. The humid conditions affects Aschenbach's health, and the health department advises visitors and citizens to avoid shellfish as there are rumors of contagion. The city begins to have a strong odor of disinfectants. Later on, Aschenbach will find out that a cholera epidemic has hit the city. After an orgiastic dream, Aschenbach realizes he has sexual desires for Tacho, and he begins to fret about his age and the state his body is in. Aschenbach consequently visits the barber every day to have his hair dyed and his face painted to look more youthful, exactly like Goethe depicted in that TV documentary. At the end of the novella, Tacho wades in the sea and turns halfway to look at Aschenbach, as if wanting to say, "Follow me." Aschenbach wants to get up, but collapses into his chair. His dead body is discovered a few minutes later. Tacho has become Aschenbach's Charon. As with Aschenbach's last love Tacho, Goethe's last love Ulrike. Thomas Mann wove so many different aspects of philosophy together and of myth and mythology, it would need another podcast episode to dive into this stellar piece of art. Suffice it to say that he includes the connection of erotic love and philosophical wisdom traced in Plato's Symposium and in his Phaedrus. He weaves in the Nietzschean contrast between Apollo, the god of restraint and shaping form, and Dionysus, the god of excess and passion. And Thomas Mann does so with only few words. He describes Aschenbach as someone who for all of his life has lived like a clenched fist. At the end of his life, this fist will have relaxed into an open hand. The development from Apollo to Dionysus. And of all places, it could only happen in Italy, the mysterious south that Goethe was so occupied with himself. In a letter to Karl Maria Weber, Thomas Mann explicitly refers to Goethe's infatuation with Ulrike von Levetzow as original inspiration. It was his intention to write about passion as a confusion and degradation, and there are astonishing and obvious parallels between the protagonist Gustav Aschenbach and Goethe. Goethe too was hugely successful and widowed and ennobled at the court of Weimar, and fell in love to a much younger teenager, and was declined that love, and had a special relationship to Italy, and you could add Kurt Eisler's analysis of homosexuality there as well. Italy, the country that Rousseau traveled to and had his sexual liberation with a prostitute in Venice. Venice, where Nietzsche lived between 1880 and 1887, and would go on to say about it, "If I had to look for a word to replace music, I could only think of Venice." In a short blog post, Emanuele Finardi muses about Venice as the birthplace of Nietzsche. His lines are just wonderful food for thought, which is why I quote them here at length, and not just because they also refer to Goethe.
In Venice, Nietzsche began writing a series of notes that he provisionally entitled The Shadow of Venice, an embryo of what would later become the text of Aurora. This was a very particular period for the philosopher who, fresh from the decision to abandon teaching in Basel after 8 years of teaching classical philology, tormented by migraine, vomiting, and weakened eyesight, began an erratic wandering in search of the ideal climate, chasing health and well-being along an Italian journey that would end in 1888 with the fatal crisis of Piazza Carignano in Turin. These were the times that led to the gestation of Ecce Homo, published in 1888, where Nietzsche linked liberation from Wagnerian idealism to the concept of the free spirit, wandering, on the road, on the model of Goethe and Montaigne. Idealism does not belong to me, where you see ideal things. I see human things a high, too human. These are precisely the pages, so different from those previously written. The moments in which the artist-philologist transforms himself into the philosopher with the hammer, and in which a type of world conception moves towards the end while a new one is born in his mind, not always clear, but certainly extremely powerful. The Nietzsche we know was therefore really born in Venice, where his personal conversion took place. Venice that the philosopher defines as the city of 100 deep solitudes, Venice where, as had happened to his father and brother Joseph, Nietzsche began to gradually lose his memory. That Nietzsche who, after all, wrote for poets and artists, not for these philosophers he often despised, was born but not died in Venice.
Both Goethe's Faust and Thomas Mann's Death in Venice essentially revolve around the trope of aging men and their desire to be vital again at the end of their life. But whereas Aschenbach dies, Goethe's Faust not only becomes young again, he also wins the wager with Mephistopheles and consequently enters heaven. Unrequited love, the main theme of Goethe's own literary work, Sorrows of Young Werther, except that now it will be the sorrows of old Goethe. And again, this experience will fuel Goethe to write a poem many describe as his most beautiful, the Marienbad Elegy. As you can glimpse from all of this, Goethe had perfected what modern psychologists would describe as the mode that made civilization possible at all, the act of sublimation.
Sublimation of instinct is an especially conspicuous feature of cultural development. It is what makes it possible for higher psychical activities, scientific, artistic, or ideological, to play such an important part in civilized life.
In his study, Civilization and Its Discontents, Sigmund Freud goes on to define sublimation as
a vicissitude which has been forced upon the instincts entirely by civilization.
Sigmund Freud was an unwavering admirer of the German literary titan exactly because of this eroticism. He received the Goethe Prize in 1930, and in his speech upon receiving the prize he noted that Goethe had always held Eros in high esteem. In his study Beyond Discontent, Sublimation from Goethe to Lacan, Eckhard Goebel carefully reconstructs sublimation in the works of Goethe, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Freud, Thomas Mann, Theodor Adorno, and Jacques Lacan. To quote Goebel,
Goethe himself, most notably in Poetry and Truth, Dichtung und Wahrheit, characterized his own work as the subliminational processing of experiences, especially those which are overwhelming or erotic, describing poetry as a hot air balloon that lifts us above the murky world of frustrations.
According to his reading, Goethe's work delivers not only a paradigm but a provocation. Poetry does not allow suffering to disappear, rather it exhibits it as suffering.
When in their anguish other men fall silent, a God gave me the power to tell my pain.
As the motto for his Marienbad elegy, Goethe chose these two lines from his drama Toccato Tasso. Toccato Tasso, one of the most widely read European poets until the beginning of the 20th century, is himself paradigm and provocation. Just like Nietzsche 300 years later, Tasso died with a mental illness days before he was to be crowned on the Capitoline Hill as the King of Poets by Pope Clement VIII. Obviously, Goethe would write a drama about such a figure, just like he had done earlier with the figure of Götz von Berlichingen. We will return to Toccato Tasso later during the series, since it is the drama that Goethe works on while he is traveling to Sicily. Goethe was keenly aware of his own interior process of sublimation as he zooms in on it in his autobiography, Poetry and Truth.
And so began that tendency which throughout my life I have never overcome, namely to transform whatever gladdened or tormented me, or otherwise occupied my mind, into an image, a poem, and to come to terms with myself by doing this, so that I could both refine my conceptions of external things and calm myself inwardly in regard to them. It is likely that no one needed this talent more than I, since my nature kept propelling me from one extreme to the other. Therefore all my published works are but fragments of one great confession.
Whatever Goethe did, he was all in. He wanted to give his complete being in every moment of his life. The risk with this principle is cold-heartedness. As his wife Christiane Vulpius lay dying in her bedroom in agony, Goethe literally closed his ears to her screams, went into another room, got a cold. At her death, he simply said, "Take her away." He had been all in with life, but with her death he was not to have any of it. It was too overwhelming for him to cope with it. But he would turn his experience into poetry when he wrote as her epitaph,
You try, O sun, without success to shine through the dreary clouds. The only gain of my life is to weep for her loss.
I am reminded as well of an episode in his childhood. Johann Wolfgang and Cornelia were to be the only of 5 children to live to adulthood. When his younger brother died, Goethe was around 7 years old. His mother noted with surprise that young Goethe did not mourn the death of his brother. Rather, he was angry because he had prepared so much that he had wanted to teach his younger brother, and that preparation was now in vain. Coping mechanism of an overwhelmed child. And when Goethe's son August died in 1830, of all places in Rome, during his own Italian journey, Goethe wrote the epitaph for the grave in Italy, which is heartbreaking, though maybe in unexpected ways. Goethe, the son, preceding the father, passed away at the age of 40 in 1830. There was precious little place for August in the sphere of Johann Wolfgang. Even at his death, August was the mere son of the Übermensch Goethe. August's whole life was but a mere copy of Goethe's own life. Having been born out of wedlock, he would go on to study law like his father and become a privy councillor at the court of Weimar Saxony in his early 30s. But August would never overcome the speechlessness of being son of the greatest poet of the German nation. Instead, he would remain the mere administrator of the life of his overwhelming and overpowering father. On a curious side note, Goethe only was informed about the death of his August by another August, August Kästner, who served as a diplomat of the Holy See. This August Kästner was the son of Lotte Kästner, the eponymous Charlotte after which Goethe had modelled the Charlotte in his The Sorrows of Young Werther. Wherever you dig into Goethe's life, you fall into another rabbit hole. That is one thread that runs through all of Goethe's life, the denial of death. how he dealt with the death of his brother, his wife, his son, says a lot about the character he was. Whatever Dionysian experience there is to have, let's enjoy it, but aging or even death, that is nothing to even think or talk about. But Goethe, once favored by the gods, remains immortal. He wrote to Schiller, if I recall correctly, that he was very much aware that his life project was greater than himself, that his project, whatever it was, would surpass him. He sure was right about that. Goethe denied a goal-directed conception of life. Instead, every moment of life had value and meaning in itself. Since every literary work has a beginning and an end, he wanted to get everything done. Creative unrest defined all of his life. In a conversation with Eckermann in 1829, he remarks, nature should have given him a different mode of being to carry his restless, creating and creative spirit. Creativity was the transcending act connecting the individual, natural below, with the eternal, supranatural above. Creativity is how you turn your life into art. Art becomes the one true, good and beautiful subject in life. How do you make sense of your life? By narrating it, by writing it down in poetry, drama and novel. Simply, you make your life a deliberate piece of art, and that art becomes your religion. And in doing so, you help others make sense of their lives. In a world living in transcendental homelessness, according to George Lukács, after God has been declared dead, the poet with a monarchical view is the last narrator left to help solve a meaning crisis. Life is art, art becomes life. And it becomes a new religion that will bring you down to your knees.
True poetry makes itself known by the fact that it, as a secular gospel, can free us from our oppressive earthly burdens with its inner serenity and external delights. Like an air balloon, it lifts us, with our ballast attached, into higher regions and lets the tangled maze of earth lie unrolled before us in bird's eye perspective. The sprightliest and the gravest works have an identical purpose, which is to moderate pleasure and pain by means of a felicitous, ingenious presentation.
But there's a real downside to it. For one, Goethe implies that truth is nothing permanent but something malleable and itself constantly subject to change. So while you can be truthful, truth may have shifted already without your own doing, and therefore one needs to readapt and reconfigure to this new reality all the time. You can easily go slightly mad from this whirlwind of transformation where all that is solid melts into air. There is another caveat that Goethe himself hints at in his Marienbad elegy and elsewhere. In a summary of existential dread, Goethe realizes that even art as a religion may not hold water in the end.
The world's all lost, myself as well I'm losing. I once the favourite of the gods on high. They tested me, for me Pandora choosing, so rich in gifts, in her more dangers lie. They urged me to that generous mouth to fate me. They separate me and annihilate me.
Eckhard Goebel sums up this existential disenchantment at the end of Goethe's life and poetry. He revokes the doctrine of sublimation as he finds the singular and tragic case of the Werther to be the general rule when it comes to love. It remains unrequited. In the words of Marianne Wünsch, rather than a meaningful development towards ever higher purposes, what occurs instead is a repetition of failure that negates meaning. So here's Eckhard Goebel.
With this generalization of the tragic trajectory, Goethe's dreary doctrine of love has reached that state of existential disenchantment which would be confirmed in the 20th century by Jean-Paul Sartre in his distraught study of passion, the argumentation of which Lacan deemed simply irrefutable. The Elegy, the trilogy's center, mercilessly asserts the breakdown of meaning that occurs via a series of failures. As a reading of the trilogy demonstrates, Goethe's late work documents a total catastrophe of meaning, thus asserting the collapse of the era's idealist philosophy. As reconciliation, the trilogy's closing poem shows, only music is capable of compensating for this conclusion, and even then, only conditionally. The transition in aesthetic theory from Schiller to Schopenhauer is here already complete.
It's such an interesting parallel that out of Dionysian rites and cultic practices grew Greek tragedy and comedy within a religious context. And what would emerge out of Goethe's Bacchantian lifestyle in his youth and early adulthood? Timeless German literature. Of course, there have been other contemporary stellar poets and playwrights like Novalis, Schiller, Eichendorff, Johann Paul Friedrich Richter, better known as Jean-Paul. Good grief, what marvelous company. But Goethe stands out and is remembered as having single-handedly defined the periods of Sturm und Drang, Romanticism and Weimar Classicism, which reinstated Greek antiquity as the age to learn from. It's just impossible to ignore him. This wraps up episode 1 of Goethe's Italian journey, though we haven't set a foot on Italy at all yet. Next time, we'll look at the 2 pieces of art that propelled Goethe onto the European literary landscape within 1 year, Götz von Berlichingen and The Sorrows of Young Werther. We'll also spend some time on Goethean matters of faith and matters of science in preparation for the Italian journey. We live in exciting times, where it is possible to create and produce a podcast from your basement. This production would not have been possible without Presoner Studio One, a fantastic digital audio workstation, with the Go XLR mini podcast mixer, and even with the aid of artificial intelligence. I've used the insanely good AI translation program DeepL where necessary. And I was able to include the marvelous voice generating software of 11labs.io to hopefully make this a more immersive experience for you. So thanks to my digital companions Rachel, Dorothy, Michael, and Jeremy. Finally, I'm indebted to the royalty-free podcast music available at pixabay.com. A shout-out goes especially to Yevhen Onochenko, Dmitry Kolesnikov, and Grand Project for their beautiful music. Until next time, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Goethe's father was a grandfather, was a mother, working to earn money. During his studies at the University of Jena, his father, that's not Jena, it's the interest in sciences, minerals, observations of natural phenomena from a grain of dust to the development of all natural phenomena in general, as in Leipzig, where Goethe used his part-time study of law to published his study of Goethe and psychoanalytic, yes.